Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you can join us for Digital Wellness Checkup. I'm Jasmine Hood Miller, Director of Family Engagement and Community Partnerships at Common Sense Media. I'm privileged to be the moderator for this wonderful conversation that we'll have today. And as a mom of three who are 10 and under, this topic really hits home as my husband and I are raising kids in a very online, digital, tech-filled world. And just because I work in this space and have for many years, living and parenting with all the new things being thrown at us almost daily isn't easy. There's apps, there's streaming, AI, and we haven't even hit what's to come in preteen and teen years yet. And that's the thing, like preparing our kids and giving them the digital savviness to navigate all of these things has to start early because our children are using these tools and devices at earlier ages. We give our kids digital footprints before they're even born. And as soon as their little cute hands can reach for our phones, they're swiping away like old pros. So for those of you who may be familiar with Common Sense, you are most likely familiar with our media ratings and reviews that help families find quality, age-appropriate movies, books, TV shows, and more. What you may or may not know is that those reviews, along with our educational resources and advocacy efforts, are all underpinned by our independent research. We study the impact of media and tech on kids' physical, emotional, social, and intellectual development. And this research informs the resources that we create to support your child's healthy development. Our latest research report is the Common Sense Census, Media Use by Kids 0 to 8, 2025. This is the fifth iteration of the census. It's a long-running series that we have that examines trends among media consumption of young children, providing insights into the role that technology plays from the crib to the classroom. The last 0 to 8 census was conducted in early 2020, just before the pandemic, which means that this new report gives us a unique post-pandemic examination of media use and changes in children's media habits over this time period. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our guest today. I'm pleased to be joined by the author of this report, my wonderful colleague, Supreet Mann. Dr. Supreet Mann is Director of Research at Common Sense. She holds a PhD in communication and a master's degree in child development from UC Davis. Her research uses a developmental lens to consider the role of social influences on children's behavior and learning. And to help us put this information into practice is Dr. Erica Lee. Dr. Lee is an attending psychologist and training director of the psychology internship program at Boston Children's Hospital. And she's also an assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Lee specializes in evidence-based and culturally responsive care for youth and families with an emphasis on parent education and increasing access to care. So welcome, Dr. Mann and Dr. Lee. So since I just mentioned this new research, Supreet, can you just start us off and tell us more about it?
Yeah, I'd love to. And thank you so much for having me. Our new research that's releasing this week, it uses a nationally representative survey of almost 1,600 parents of kiddos aged 0 to 8, so starting in infancy up through age 8. Like you mentioned earlier, this is the fifth in a long-standing series that looks at the media habits of these young kids. And this particular iteration was conducted last August and asked about children's media use, especially focused on their time that's spent with different devices and platforms, as well as the types of content that's viewed and the social environment and context of their viewing.
One of the first things that stood out for me when I was reading the key findings was that the amount of time children 8 and younger are spending with screen media hasn't changed drastically, but what they're consuming is. What did you all find?
Yeah, we were really surprised, and maybe pleasantly so, to see that the overall amount of screen media use didn't change significantly from early 2020 to this latest iteration in 2024. It was about 2.5 hours that kiddos were spending looking at screen media. Now, what we did find is that the breakdown of this media usage did change a little bit. So they're spending a little less time with TV and videos, although TV and videos is still the primary screen media that young kids are using. And they are spending a little more time with gaming. And I'm happy to talk about all of these things in this conversation today.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this evolution in my own home with my family. When we had our first baby, we literally tried to shield his eyes from anytime a screen was around, which was kind of ridiculous and also ridiculously hard. But by the time we got to our third, it was like, good luck, all bets are off. um, and we know that folks like the American Academy of Pediatrics adjusted their recommendations a few years back to not just monitor screen time with a stopwatch or timer, but to kind of take some of those nuances into consideration. Erica, what is some of the science around brain development in this age range? And do we know the effects of technology on things like attention span or developing social skills?
It's a great question. Thank you. And I'm laughing. I appreciate your anecdotes about your family, Jasmine. I'm laughing only because, this sort of joke around, the first baby sort of gets all the attention and you follow everything by the book. And then by the third baby, they're just sort of taking care of themselves and doing their own thing. I think that's a
Exactly.
very real experience I hear from families all the time. But absolutely. So what we know, right, is that the brains of babies and young children are especially plastic and adaptable. There's so much development. 0 to 8 is a huge range. And it really is a critical range, especially the ages of 0 to 2. What kids are learning at that time is as they're forming all of these new brain connections, you've mentioned attention, social skills, all the experiences that they're actually having in the real world are critical. So when you think about our littlest ones, the most important things for them are what sort of physical activities are they doing? Are they getting enough sleep? And really importantly, are they interacting with other people, so socially in the real world live. Their brains are still figuring out, how do I react to reward? How do I make decisions? What's judgment, right? These are things that are all starting to come online between 0 and 8. So understandably, of course, they're all impacted by how much screen time they're getting and the quality of that screen time. Specifically in regards to attention, I'll start with that first, is what we know is that for young children, having a lot of screen time, especially what we think of as like passive viewing, which I know your team has done a lot of work around, can reduce their attention span and of course make it harder to concentrate on more than one activity or even one activity for an extended period of time. And this is especially problematic at night, right? So that if kids are using screens, it impacts bedtime. It's making it so that their sleep quality is worse. They're not necessarily getting enough sleep, and sleep impacts everything. So not only their sleep or their attention, but of course how they're interacting with other people. And then with social skills, it's interesting because what the research shows is actually a little bit more of a mixed picture. So on one hand, having more screen time means, of course, less live social interaction, and you're having less opportunities to build social skills, practice cause and effect, start to learn what social cues look like as kids get older, learning how to take other people's perspectives. But, there's also maybe a little bit of shielding around if you get higher quality educational content. So I think the typical kind of example we often use is Sesame Street, that actually can support things like children's language skills, their cultural awareness, their creativity. One point I always like to make when we're thinking about young kids and their brain development, especially at these young ages and screen time, is that kids are not so great about telling the difference between what they see digitally and what they think the world is digitally from the real world. And so a lot of times kids, especially when they're younger, think that those are the same, and they're really not, right? There's so much more sort of nuance and sort of cognitive load and things that they have to track and respond to in real time, in the real world that they're not seeing digitally. So we just really want to make sure that our kids aren't losing out on real live experiences and learning about the real world in favor of a primarily digital world.
There's several things in there that I want to touch on that you just mentioned. And thinking, kind of going back to attention span, and you mentioned like shows like PBS. I mean, we've all experienced binge watching and getting sucked into a YouTube rabbit hole. But Supreet, is there a difference between kids watching a long form 30-minute show like a Sesame Street versus a bunch of like 30-second short form videos? Does the video length matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, in this wave of our survey, it was the first time that we tried to parcel this apart and figure this out. So we asked parents specifically about their children viewing short form videos like TikTok, Instagram Reels, or YouTube Shorts. And we found that 16% of kids watch short form videos daily, with an average of 14 minutes per day spent watching. And remember, this is for little kids under 8. The research that's looking at short form versus long form content, though, is somewhat mixed, so we should take this with a grain of salt. But what we do know is that for young children, long form content is typically more developmentally appropriate, as it encourages children to engage with a storyline, engage with characters in a more meaningful and lasting way. Short form content is often really quick with fast cuts and doesn't promote that type of long term attention.
And we also mentioned that interaction, right? And so we also saw that gaming is on the rise with this age group. I know, especially with older kids, gaming can be a way to interact with friends, maybe not so much with the younger ages, but even if you're, gaming together as a family, is there any difference with gaming from versus other types of screen time or screen use? Are there drawbacks to gaming? And also, is there a difference between boys and girls with this?
Yeah, so gaming is often considered a more social screen experience than other types of screen media. And even when not social, sometimes it can be thought of as more cognitively engaging, more complex. Kids are often problem solving, they're completing puzzles, and so on. But what we found was that there are not an overwhelming majority of young kids, at least, seem to be gaming socially with friends or people they know. And in fact, about 10% of kids said that they had gamed online with someone that they didn't know. So while gaming can certainly be a more social experience and can be a really positive social experience, both for children and families, there certainly are some cautions to be had around that. And overall, like I mentioned in the beginning, we did notice a really notable increase in time spent gaming among young children across all devices, so consoles, handhelds, computers, tablets, smartphones. We saw time spent gaming went from 23 minutes in early 2020 to 38 minutes in 2024, a 65% increase. And you mentioned boys versus girls. And we did find that boys played on average for 20 minutes longer than girls did. And the most notable space where this difference occurred was in console gaming. So boys were more likely to play console games than girls. But on other types of devices, so smartphones, tablets, computers, the difference between boys and girls gaming wasn't that significant. So it's interesting to note that while there are certainly differences in how kiddos are approaching games, there are differences in the types of games, and there's differences in the engagement and the cognitive complexity of games versus other types of screen media. A lot of this really should be thought about in a case by case basis and how individual children are acting and interacting with those games.
So, one of the things that I think parents and caregivers might be carrying around is some guilt about using a phone or tablet to keep their child or their children quiet or occupied. Devices can be used to comfort or soothe a child or a parent. And when we use devices as a distraction to calm a child down, can this make our kid like emotionally dependent on that device? Curious what you think about that, Supreet. And then Erica, in those moments when your kid is having a meltdown because you've taken the iPad, away for dinner, like what can you do? So I'm going to give the first part of the question to Supreet is, do these practices disrupt their emotional regulation? And then Erica, like, what do we do?
We did, again, in this report, look at how children and families use devices, both in the home and outside the home. We looked at how they use it for comfort during meal times, both at restaurants and in the home, and to help them fall asleep. And we found that devices can play many roles for young children. 17% of parents reported that they've given their child a device to help them calm down, and about a fifth to a quarter reported using the device at meal times. And another fifth or so said that they use the device to help them fall asleep. But there are a lot of reasons parents might let their child use screens in these different contexts. So 2/3 of our survey said that they have let their kids use screens at least sometimes in order to get things done or take time for themselves. And it's really important to remember that while overall it might be really alarming to think about using screens sort of as a soother or in these different contexts, it's important to remember that device use in public can be an adaptive behavior for many parents and families, one that allows them to spend time with other people, to cook for their family, or even for parents to seek medical or personal care. In this way, the device can help to foster these kinds of social experiences. But of course, for a lot of families, overuse and overdependence is certainly a risk. We want children who can regulate their emotions to learn to do so without the need of a screen in every context. And I'd love to hear what Erica has to say as well about how we can manage this in the real world.
So absolutely agree. Wonderfully stated. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm glad to hear sort of the research that you've most recently conducted backs that up. I think that all makes perfect sense. I want to appropriately give my kids access to screens, but when I do, they get so upset. And then it almost feels like once they've had access to a screen, all they do is crave that screen. And then we're just constantly arguing about it. As you're saying, there's always these meltdowns when I'm taking away the tablet or the phone. So I kind of say a few things to families. Is one, it helps to actually take a step back and just as caregivers decide, like, what are our expectations and our boundaries around screen time? Because sometimes families, very understandably, I think as Supreet was just describing, like they're using phones and tablets in ways that make sense for their family. Like, I need to be able to get a meal on the table, or we sometimes want to go out as a family and our kids need a distraction. And it can absolutely be a helpful tool, as she described, around managing frustration or sort of short-term distraction. And it really helps to give kids a sense of, okay, what are actually our family's values and rules around when do we use screens? How long do we use them for? I'm going to make sure I'm giving you a warning, like, okay, 2 more minutes or 5 more minutes, and then the screens are going away. We've decided even ahead of time and maybe had a conversation with you, which of course kids are not going to remember, especially our little ones, and without many reminders. Here are the expectations around screen time. So we get it for a certain amount of time, and when we take it away, you might be a little bit upset. But if we continue to kind of argue, or it seems like it's really hard to sort of give a screen and then take it away, then maybe as your parents and your loving caregivers, we need to evaluate, does it make sense to be giving you these screens in all of these instances? Knowing that, of course, again, sometimes it just makes sense. The other thing I say to parents is, in some ways, this is also like a longer term game, right? Is that it's really hard as caregivers to be consistent about almost anything. None of us is 100% consistent, even with ourselves, much less with another caregiver if you're co-parenting. But it can actually confuse kids if sometimes we're told, okay, I get screens and I get it for as long as I can because, understandably, my parents have important things to do. And then it's confusing if other times my parents say, well, before dinner, it's only for 10 minutes and it's a hard stop at 10 minutes. So trying to create a little bit of consistency and routine around what are the expectations and then managing to that can over the long term also help parents set sort of firm boundaries around what are we trying to do here, and help kids learn what to expect and then to stick to that. And then I just also want to echo what Supreet was saying is, don't beat yourselves up. Like, adults use screens in this way too for distraction. If you're someone who is using screens in this way to kind of help your kids regulate their frustration, to keep them quiet, to kind of manage child caregiving, that all makes sense. And just try not to make it sort of like the default strategy, because our kids do need to learn, how do I regulate emotions? How do I delay gratification? How do I self-soothe when I can't have my way? And also when I have to give up something I really like finally getting screen time, in the evening or something like that.
I think those are really important points. And, kind of going back to those routines around sleep and balancing physical activities, is overstimulation a concern? Is that something that when you're trying to, settle down for bed or move on to a different activity, is that something parents should be worried about?
Absolutely, especially for our little ones, right? So I think we kind of already have talked a little bit as a group around like bedtime. This is kind of the hardest time anyway for most families in general, is like we have less capacity, both the kids and the adults. We're much more likely to sort of melt down and to have more arguments. And if you have more than one child, like you do, Jasmine, it's really easy to say, well, we only have so many hands and so many adults, and we're trying to manage sort of multiple bedtimes, and it can get overwhelming pretty fast.
Yeah,
but we know that, yes, and we know that exposure to screens, there's a reason the American Academy of Pediatrics says try really hard not to have exposure to the blue light that's related to screen use at least an hour before bedtime, because it activates your brain. The overstimulation that you're describing is absolutely a thing, because so much of technology and content is meant to keep us engaged. For any of us adults who've gotten sucked into just like doom scrolling or being on your phone for a long time, we fall prey to that too. But it's even more so for our kids, because their brains are still developing, and many of these programs are meant to be really bright, really engaging, really active. They're meant to keep you really sort of focused on one video into the next. And so we want to be mindful, especially for our little ones who are still developing, how do I control my attention? That this can absolutely be overstimulating. Is going to make it even harder for kids to get off of it. So you want to be careful around what times of the day are you allowing your kids screen time? And of course, as we've been talking about, how much screen time they're getting in a certain chunk and what they're doing during that time is really important to be thoughtful around.
Yeah, we know that, tech design is meant to hold our attention, and none of it was designed for kids. And, it makes me wonder if, they're choosing these things or it's choosing them. But, kind of speaking about these other activities, reading is a critical skill that kids are learning during this age range. And we notice a trend with parents reading to little ones under 2 more, but less so with kids ages 5 to 8. Supreet, you know, I think most parents know, but like, why is reading together important? And does it matter if it's a physical book or an e-reader?
So when we looked at the overall percentage of parents who report that their child reads or is read to daily, we did not see any significant change from 2020 or 2017 even to 2024. But when we broke this down by age groups, we did. So we found that for younger kiddos, those under 2, the percentage of parents who report that their child reads or is read to has increased by nearly 10 percentage points. Yay, that's good. But for parents of older kids, so age 5 to 8, the percentage of parents who reported the same decreased by about 10 percentage points. The research about why reading is important is pretty solid. So we know reading is good for vocabulary building for these young children. It's good for comprehension. Having this sort of consistent story that they're able to move through at a more developmentally appropriate pace is really great for children being able to understand how social interactions happen, how people fit together. It's also great for young kids from a bonding perspective between parent and child. So reading on the whole is really a developmentally important aspect.
I think this kind of falls in line with parents' overall concern about the amount of time their children are spending on screens while simultaneously seeing that technology as a tool for learning and connection. Those possibilities are both there. As a parent, how do you know if a video or app or a game is educational? I feel like everything when you go into the app store, you look at things that there's that label on there, but how do you actually know if it's going to help your child learn?
Yeah, the educational value of a website, app, game, video can be really hard to figure out, at least initially. What we really want to look for good quality educational videos or games are ones that encourage learning by encouraging curiosity, critical thinking, and that are engaging for the child. They need to be able to teach kids concepts by engaging them in the content and encouraging the children to come back. So they really have to be this balance of fun. And sometimes even shows that may not seem initially educational can have value if parents are mediating the content, if they're talking to their child about the themes that they are seeing, they're moderating the content by sharing with the child the types of social and emotional outcomes that the characters may be experiencing and helping the child understand some of those other educational elements that may not be quite as apparent on the screen or may not even be the intended use of that content.
I just wanted to reiterate, and it's been said before, but I want to state it again, that we're really about a no judgment zone here. Every family is different, and that's why it's important to evaluate your own values and needs. And I think that it's much more helpful to focus on how we can be intentional while giving ourselves grace and focus less on any shame or guilt. And so with that in mind, Erica, how important is role modeling? Are we sending mixed messages as parents to our kids? And how can we just be more intentional with our own media and tech habits?
I really love this question because role modeling matters a lot. What we know, it sounds like a cliche, but it's so true, right? One of the primary ways that our kids learn about the world is through observing our example. And they're often around, friends, family, adults, who are important in their lives the most. And so these are the people that they're observing the most. And what our kids learn from us, I really love that you brought up values because it's so true, right? Like when our kids see how do we spend our free time, whether that's just quick 5 minutes here and there, throughout a really busy evening with our families, it tells them like what's important to us as a family and also what are safe and appropriate ways to interact with the world. So that includes things like modeling how to balance screen use with other important activities like live interaction with our family, time on other activities that matter to us, getting physical exercise, getting outside of our houses, not letting screen time get in the way of other important tasks or interactions. And one of the things that I really like in thinking about this kind of question is that when parents start to think for themselves, okay, how am I using screens in my own life? How can I model healthy screen use for my families? It actually really allows them to focus on the things that they can control, right? So much of what I hear from parents in terms of their fears and worries around technology and screen use and trying to understand how to navigate this world that, as you said, is changing at all times, is so much of it is out of our control. Our kids are kind of doing things independently. they're learning about things from their friends. They may be seeing things online as they get older, but this is actually an area where you have a lot of agency and a lot of influence on your kids. And so setting routines around screen time, right? So time that, and oftentimes parents tell me that this becomes very freeing for them, is like, we started to have either screen-free zones in our home. So for example, a really common one is like at meal times. No one has their devices unless it's an absolute emergency. We're really sitting around and spending time together as a family. And then also on nights and weekends, there are actually times of the day that we consider screen-free time. So there's no devices. People are just either interacting with each other. Maybe you're doing homework, maybe you're doing another activity, maybe you're just spending some time together, but you're not on screens. Because research has found that the more that parents use screens, the more kids use screens. It makes total sense. And this is absolutely an area where saying to kids, do as I say and not as I do, is absolutely not effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate goal is to empower our kids, and so by modeling that, that is definitely one way. Giving them digital literacy skills to think critically and understand their own relationship with technology is important because it helps them build healthy habits for their well-being. And you mentioned that independence, right? So, like as we're talking about some of the older ages in this group, where kids are starting to manage their own screen time, how can we encourage that autonomy without feeling like, like we're hovering over them or being a helicopter parent?
It's such a great question, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness behind it, because it is really important that kids learn things like digital wellness, digital literacy, right? That we're not going backwards in terms of how much technology is a part of everyday life. And there are also a lot of really important positives, and that it's really actually very adaptive to know how to use technology and to use it responsibly. You may have heard this before, and I know this is very consistent with the way that your organization thinks about media use and technology, but it's really all about balance, right? So I talk so much with families around, of course, having boundaries around, like, as I was just saying, when do we have access to screens, in what ways, how are we using screens, do we know how to use them responsibly? But then also thinking about screen time as one component of your overall day and one activity that you may engage in at different times and in different ways, but it's not hopefully the primary activity. And really importantly, it's not crowding out other really critical things. So I know we've talked a lot about sleep, but like using screens and technology are not getting in the way of getting a really good night's sleep. It's not getting in the way of meals or family time or making sure you're getting adequate physical activity. It's not replacing primarily as a way of social interaction, getting that live interactions and learning about cause and effect in the world and building our social skills in real time in the real world. I think sometimes families can end up sort of in an all or nothing space where it feels a little like, okay, I really want to be careful and responsible and thinking about how my child's using screen time, and it ends up being sort of an all or nothing proposition. And really, balance is probably the most realistic way to think about setting our kids up to use media responsibly in the future, and having some time where you use media together with your kids. So I know Supreet was talking so nicely about sort of reading with your children and having that be a shared activity, but also consuming media should also be something that includes like what we call co-viewing, right? Where you are sitting down with your kids, you're consuming media or using technology together in some way, so you can model for your kids, how do I use it? Let me see how you're using it. Let me answer questions for you. Let me explain what it is you're seeing, especially for our little ones. So there's lots of opportunities here to think about setting that balance, and also continuing to role model for your kids. How do we have a healthy, appropriate relationship with media? And how do we figure out how to set you up well so that you can use screen time responsibly and safely moving forward?
I love that. Okay, and I want to keep this going for a few more minutes with some questions that were submitted in advance by the parents in the audience. The first question I will, and either one of you can take this, is around finding a happy medium with media when you have a large family. And this even, happens in my own house with the age range of my kids. But the question is, if every kid gets X amount of screen time, it seems to take up like the whole afternoon. How do you navigate media and tech rules in a home with kids of different ages, setting different limits, age appropriateness? Any tips? Is this even realistic?
I'll jump in. But I think Erica did a really nice job of really talking about how to manage media in the home environment by doing things like creating device-free time, right? So mealtime, maybe after dinner, there's no devices for anyone in the family, parents included, in order to model that positive behavior, in order to model what balance in your media diet should look like. And also doing things like creating age-appropriate guidelines around tech use, having open dialogue and conversation with especially the older children about what appropriate device screen time looks like for them, talking to your younger kiddos about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate device time. Yeah, I think a lot of what Erica talked about really applies in this situation. Families with multiple kids, it just gets harder with every child. And as those ages become more and more dispersed, that becomes a greater challenge as well. But I think the most important aspect really is going to be to have open conversation with your kids, to model positive behavior, and to establish times when you are engaging as a family in device-free activities.
I love that. And if I could just add one thing, I agree with everything that Supreet was just saying, but I also think too, there's a lot of great tools that are available to families. So, I know on your website has the tech planner, right, where you can kind of customize how are we thinking about tech for children of different ages. I also really like the family media plan tool that's through healthychildren.org, which comes from the American Academy for Pediatrics. And one thing I really like about that tool is that families can kind of choose, like, so going back to this idea of values, what are our values and priorities if we're thinking about screen time for my specific family? Now let me set some certain goals, and then everyone participates, right? So like, what are our goals as parents? What are our goals for children of different ages? And then you can kind of adjust as you go. And so it kind of helps you create a plan for thinking about, how do I want to set up these tech-free zones that we're talking about? How do I want to set my kids up to say kids of different ages have maybe different exposure to screen time in a way that I think often for families feels a little bit more manageable, because it creates a concrete plan that you can then follow.
Okay, and then another question that we got was around kind of helping kids avoid comparing their screen time to peers who may have unrestricted access to, media and technology. And then kind of along those same lines, like, how do we deal with peer pressure when our kids are wanting to get a phone because it feels like all their friends have one? Do all their friends have one? We know that there are kids at this age who have devices. And so like, how do we kind of navigate that peer pressure?
So this is a great question. And I hear this a lot of times from families as well. It's actually, I think, the number one reason, at least in my clinical practice, that I hear from parents. I feel like I can't keep avoiding giving my kid a phone, even if I don't want to, because I'm just constantly hearing about this sort of peer pressure piece. And what I remind parents of is, one, try to stay strong, because it's really, really hard to resist when your kid is really upset around this kind of thing. And similar to, anything else that you may give your child access to that involves both a big reward, but also some risk, like swimming or driving a car, you have to decide for yourself, regardless of how old your child is and regardless of what their friends are doing, if they're actually ready for that responsibility. And that, of course, means that one child who is 8 is not the same as every other child who is 8. And do we know what it means to have, say, access to a phone? How do we use it safely? How do we use it appropriately? In terms of just specific steps of what I tell parents to do is, first, try to open up the conversations. I know that's already been a little bit of a theme of our conversation today, is try to understand why your specific kid or kids actually wants a phone. Oftentimes kids are like, well, just everyone else has one, and they're really maybe not actually that interested, especially some of our younger kids, in having a phone. For other kids, it's a really very real and somewhat painful thing to be, sort of left out of the group chat. Maybe they want to use it to watch YouTube videos, whatever it is. And so try to understand first your child's perspective and validate those reasons. Even if you don't agree with them, those are real to them. And if your child's feeling disappointed or frustrated about your sort of setting a hard line and saying, I don't think now is an appropriate time for you to have your own phone or unlimited use to a phone, that's real and that's understandable. And then I do think it's helpful for parents to try to explain to kids why you think now might not be the right time, if you think now is not the right time. So whether that's about concerns around their safety, around social skills, about making sure that they're prioritizing, face-to-face live interactions, trying to help them understand, which I know is hard, especially for our little ones, that like making an independent choice that makes sense for you may not always line up with your friends, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong choice. And then also thinking together as a family through many of the different strategies we've already talked about today, like what is the pathway to potentially getting, say, a phone or a personal computer, right? So what general age are you thinking about as a family? What sort of abilities or responsibilities do they need to demonstrate to you? What do they need to be able to be doing successfully at home or at school? Are they showing you they have other interests and hobbies? It's not just about the phone. And then lastly, I'll just throw out one other idea, which is that many times parents find it helpful to think a little bit about what would the steps be on the way to just getting a phone, right? So many families do this thing where you have a phone that has limited features. So it's a phone, but it's maybe not as smart, like where they can text, or they can call you, so they can still text with their friends, but they don't have access, say, to the internet and sort of an unlimited kind of computer capacity on their phone. Can they have access to maybe even a smartwatch that does certain things, again, but doesn't do all of the things? And then thinking together with your kids around what is the appropriate way for you also to monitor their growing use of technology to make sure that it's safe and appropriate. And what do they, again, just need to be demonstrating to you to show that they're ready for one, and taking that time together as a family to decide what makes sense for you and what makes sense for each of your individual children, depending on how old they are and where they are developmentally.
Those are really helpful tips and perspectives to keep in mind, especially when you're talking to your kids and you're thinking that you already have the answer, but it really is important to pause and hear their perspective and hear what they're thinking. I really appreciate both of you. Any final thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it can be a really scary time. Having kids in an environment where screen media is a dominant form of how children are connecting with other people, how they're being entertained, and even for older kids, how they're doing their schoolwork and learning and connecting with parents and with teachers and peers, it can be really frightening. It can feel very overwhelming, and the deluge of content can feel like a lot for parents to navigate. But I think that putting in place resources, plans for how to combat that, how to manage all of that information, how to provide guidance to your children around their device use is really key. And having those tools in hand will help you feel equipped to manage this for your children, and will help your children feel equipped to manage this for themselves as well.
I love that. The only thing that I'll add is just that, for any parents who are thinking about this, like, kudos to you already. It's so easy. We use screens so much in our everyday lives. It's actually really easy to sort of feel like, okay, we're just at the mercy of whatever's happening with technology and we have to just go with it. But sort of, watching this kind of content, like looking at all the great resources that Common Sense Media has to offer you, thinking really carefully about, like, what are our values? What are our priorities? Where are we trying to go as a family as we're thinking about responsible screen use and incorporation of technology, and equipping our kids with the essential skills to appropriately take it in, monitor their own use it safely, and then move forward with what they need to become, responsible and healthy young adolescents and then young adults. Just really points to what wonderful caregivers you are. So I just really want parents to be able to give themselves credit for thinking critically about this and trying to figure out the best way to navigate what is always a changing landscape.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank our lovely guests today, Dr. Erica Lee and Dr. Supreet Mann, for a truly informative and helpful conversation. Thank you to my teammates, Lisa and Jordan, for their assistance in producing this webinar. And thank you all for watching. Everyone who submitted questions, thank you in advance for sharing this with other parents and families that might find it helpful or useful. Please go to commonsense.org to learn about our resources for families, our research, and more. And just as Erica just said, remember that, there isn't perfection in parenting, and we're all doing our best. And just by being here on this webinar today, your kids are already being set up for success. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Common Sense is your family's go-to source for ratings and reviews for everything, including movies, games, books, and more. We're also here to support parents and caregivers with guidance on key topics such as screen time, online safety, and social media. Educators can find lesson plans and classroom tech tools. And you can learn about the important advocacy work we do to make tech safer for all kids and families. If you want access to some of our resources on the go, download our app from the App Store or Google Play. This puts our vast library of ratings and reviews right at your fingertips, wherever you are. Stay connected and informed by signing up for our free newsletters, offering everything from movie night inspiration and parenting tips to updates on how you can help us improve the digital world for kids everywhere. Sign up at commonsensemedia.org/newsletters. Supporting Common Sense means you're backing a nonprofit mission dedicated to helping families and educators thrive in a world of media and technology. Thanks for being a part of this important conversation. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more engaging discussions in the future.